Having lost my parents in a tragic accident and growing up in an orphanage, life seemed devoid of purpose, and the motivation to move forward was elusive. However, one day, an unexpected twist occurred when I received a letter supposedly from my deceased mother. Astonishingly, the return address indicated our old family home. The notion of this reality was almost too surreal to comprehend, but curiosity and a glimmer of hope prompted me to visit the address mentioned in the letter. As I approached our old home, memories flooded back, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of fear. Opting for caution, I decided to observe from the backyard first. Peering through, I identified a middle-aged couple residing there. Squinting for a closer look, I debated whether to retreat quietly if their faces remained unfamiliar. However, to my astonishment, I recognized them, my dad and mom. The unexpected turn of events left me dumbstruck. My name is Katie Anderson, and I had been placed in an orphanage at the age of 10, leaving 2 years ago. Now, juggling several part-time jobs, I lived alone in a modest apartment in New York City. The tragic loss of my parents occurred during a holiday trip on the highway, involving a multi-car pileup that claimed their lives. Surviving the accident miraculously, I found myself in a hospital bed, desperately searching for my parents. It took days to comprehend the evasive responses from the nurses and the eventual revelation from my mother's sister that my parents didn't make it. With no family to take me in, I faced the reality of being placed in an orphanage after being discharged from the hospital. Numerous uncertainties filled my mind regarding the fate of the house I once called home and the future of my education. Despite these concerns, a subtle sense of relief emerged when contemplating the prospect of not assimilating into a stranger's family. Following my recovery from the injuries sustained in the accident, instead of returning to my own house, I found myself relocated to an orphanage. During my hospitalization, my mother's sister took charge of my parents' funeral and handled their belongings. She also arranged for my personal items to be sent to the facility. Although we had exchanged letters during my hospital stay, I couldn't shake the feeling of intrusion as strangers rifled through my house. However, being a 10-year-old, there was little I could do, and the unimaginable reality of not returning home began to settle in. Yearning for answers, I grappled with the inability to express my feelings or find someone to inquire from. Life unfolded without my input, and I felt like a mere bystander carried along by the currents of fate. Upon transitioning to the orphanage, periodic letters from my mother's sister arrived, inquiring about my well-being and if I needed anything. Initially, I responded, but as time passed, I ran out of things to say, and gradually I ceased replying. My mother's sister, someone I had never met while my parents were alive, seemed like a stranger. Being cared for by someone who felt distant meant little to me, and our correspondence became a burdensome routine. Perhaps sensing my detachment, the letters from my mother's sister dwindled over the years. By the time I was ready to leave the orphanage, I had nearly forgotten about the letters, and our once distant relationship had become even more estranged. It seemed as if I was abandoned in an unfamiliar world, spending my days within the confines of the orphanage. During my hospitalization, the funeral proceeded without me, and I found myself at the facility without ever returning home. Consequently, no matter how much time passed, the surreal nature of it all refused to dissipate. The persistent question lingered in my mind: why am I here? This sense of alienation I felt during my formative years evolved into a profound loneliness as I grew older. With nothing left, I struggled to find purpose or motivation. Graduating high school and leaving the facility to enter the workforce only deepened my isolation. I couldn't fit in with my colleagues, and the differences in the work environment prompted me to quit almost immediately. Subsequently, I hopped from one job to another, always feeling out of place, and none of the positions endured. The time it took to secure a new job increased, and my limited savings rapidly dwindled. Barely scraping by with day labor jobs, I often contemplated the meaning of living in such profound loneliness. The idea of leaving my apartment and living on the streets crossed my mind multiple times, but I always hesitated, knowing that such a decision would devastate my parents if they were aware. One exhausting day in the monotony of my routine, I received a call notifying me that a letter addressed to me had arrived at the orphanage where I once resided. Out of guilt for my quick job changes, I had been avoiding any association with the facility and planned to have them discard the letter without reading it. However, the moment I learned who sent it, I felt a shock akin to being hit with a hammer. Astoundingly, the letter was from my mother, whom I believed had died in an accident when I was 10. Overwhelmed by conflicting emotions, I immediately headed to the facility to retrieve the letter. My mind was in turmoil since that unexpected call, as the fact of my parents' supposed demise at the age of 10 remained an unchangeable truth. Despite my efforts to ground myself and face reality, the impossible hope that there might be a mistake with the letter persisted against my better judgment. If my mother was truly alive, why had she left me in the facility all these years? What was her purpose in sending a letter now, after such a prolonged absence? As the train rocked me on my way to the facility, these questions plagued my mind, but I couldn't find any satisfactory answers or sort out my emotions until the very end. Joy, doubt, anger, and sadness swirled in my head, creating a chaotic mix of emotions. By the time I arrived at the facility after an hour-long journey, my mind was blank from overthinking. I muttered to myself, trying to reassure and prepare myself for whatever lay ahead. When I collected the letter from the office, I stared intently at the familiar handwriting on the envelope, confirming it was indeed my late mother's. With trepidation, I opened the envelope to find 3 letters adorned with illustrations of a character I cherished at the age of 10. The first letter, addressed to Katie on her 20th birthday, unfolded with the soft, somewhat curly handwriting of my mother, evoking aching nostalgia and welling tears. The letters overflowed with memories from my birth until age 10, along with my mother's hopes and imaginings of how I might grow in the next decade. It was unmistakably her. Trying not to get the letters wet from my tears, I looked up at the ceiling repeatedly, but the tears continued to flow, staining the paper. After reading the letters, I thanked the facility staff and promptly left, my mind still in turmoil and not in a state to talk to anyone. On the train home, I reread the letters multiple times, desperately seeking clarity. Eventually, I concluded that these letters were written before the accident. I remembered writing a letter to my mother on my 10th birthday, expressing my appreciation. It seemed she had combined her recollections of that day with her hopes for the next decade. The question remained, who sent it? The first person I thought of was my mother's sister, but the return address was our old home, not her own. Considering our lack of contact, it seemed unlikely she would send the letter in my mother's name. I drew a blank on who else it could be. Despite the confusion, the motherly warmth in the letter brought both happiness and uncertainty. Exhausted from pondering, I stashed the letter in a drawer, attempting to resume my usual life. However, the existence of the letter continued to nag at me as the days passed. Contemplating throwing it away, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I considered meeting the mysterious sender, as I didn't have much to lose. Perhaps, just maybe, they could provide assistance in my life. Unbeknownst to me, a hidden hope lingered that this letter might hold something to change my current circumstances. On a bus headed to a familiar address, I gazed absent-mindedly at a townscape that looked nothing like my memories. The changes were drastic. Fields and woods replaced by a shopping mall and houses. The station had a new bus loop and a chic cafe, making it an unfamiliar world. Upon reaching the address, I turned a street corner and was greeted by a residential area that had barely changed from 10 years ago. The sight instantly pulled me out of the colorless, hazy world and transported me back to the vibrant world from a decade ago. It was the town I used to live in, and further down the road was our family home. Without realizing it, I found myself running toward the house, filled with a peculiar sense of relief, like a school kid returning home or a long-lost child. At the end of my mad dash stood my beloved home, just as I remembered it. Indeed, the letter had been sent from this very place. However, when I reached the front of the house, I found myself unable to muster the courage to ring the doorbell. The fear of the unknown, not knowing what would happen next, held me back more than the desire to learn the truth. Contemplating my next move, I decided to discreetly scout out the backyard first. Feeling slightly uncomfortable, like a thief, I peeked into the garden. On the balcony, I observed a middle-aged couple preparing to sunbathe. The man appeared to be in a wheelchair. To ascertain if I knew them, I continued to discreetly observe, amidst their soft-spoken conversation. For a brief moment, the couple looked in my direction. The instant I saw their faces, I couldn't help but exclaim aloud, "What? Dad? Mom? You're kidding, right?" Frozen in surprise, the man in the wheelchair noticed me. "Katie, is that you, Katie?" He murmured my name, suddenly crying out loud. Overwhelmed by the shocking turn of events, I too was paralyzed. The woman, sensing something amiss, rushed out to the balcony in a panic. She ran straight to the man in the wheelchair, trying to comfort him. While sobbing, the man pointed towards me and seemed to be explaining something to the woman. She stared intently at me, then suddenly smiled and said, "You're Katie, right? I have something to talk about. Can you come in?" She invited me into her home. Though I couldn't grasp the situation, I had many questions too. I silently nodded and was ushered into the living room from the front door. During the introductions that followed, I learned the woman's name was Irene, and the man in the wheelchair was, as I suspected, my father Andrew. Furthermore, the two of them were married and apparently lived in this house alone as a couple. According to Irene, my father had been in a severe accident and had been in a critical condition hovering between life and death. I was told I should have been informed about this when I was 10, but I didn't remember it at all. When I told Irene this, she asked, "How was it explained to you?" I replied that my mother's sister had told me he was in a desperate condition with no hope of survival. But on reflection, it seemed I only heard that my mother had passed away. Irene helped me reconcile my memories with the truth for hours on end. As a result, I realized I'd made a massive misunderstanding. After the accident, the 10-year-old me, unable to comprehend my father's unconscious state, had felt rejected by him since he never came to see me. When I was 10, I believed that Daddy never came to see me because he was angry. I thought he was mad because I had insisted on going to the water park, and somehow that desire led to Mom's death. This belief, fueled by my own sense of guilt, transformed into the memory that both my parents had died in the accident. Irene tried to console me, suggesting that young Katie found it less painful to believe that both parents had passed away than to think her father hated her. While I appreciated Irene's attempt to comfort me, a question lingered. One I feared to ask but knew I would regret forever if I didn't. Taking a deep breath, I asked Irene why my father didn't come to get me. Irene exchanged glances with my father, and without saying anything, he nodded. Irene began to explain the situation at the time. Andrew, my father, regained consciousness more than half a year after the accident, coinciding with the time I was discharged from the hospital. It took him several more months to fully grasp the situation. Irene explained the difficulty of waking up feeling like he had just slept one night, only to realize half a year had passed. Additionally, post-accident complications left him with disabilities affecting his memory, speech, and body. The doctors had told him that returning to his original life was impossible. Initially, my mother's sister, believing his recovery was hopeless, proceeded with plans to place me in a care facility as scheduled. When I came to, nothing was left, and I painfully realized the length and importance of the time I'd lost while I was out. According to Irene, after being discharged, my father went directly to the disability facility where she worked. There were times he wanted to see me but couldn't articulate it. Simultaneously, he began to mentally grasp the death of my mother, Sophia. For a while, Andrew was deeply depressed and even had to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. My father, having lost everything, had once sought meaning in life amidst despair, much like me. Irene's consistent support and understanding became apparent in the narrative. She faced his unstable emotional state with patience, using handmade cards and whiteboards to communicate with him. Irene even provided massages daily to prevent muscle stiffening and helped him practice conversing. My father, Andrew, once remarked to Irene, "I see traces of Sophia in you." I thought Sophia would be saddened by my pitiful state, which made me feel like I had to pull myself together. This sentiment was a testament to how important Irene had become to him. Hearing this story, I felt incredibly comforted, realizing my father hadn't disliked or forgotten about me. On the contrary, he cared about me so much that it drove him to mental illness. Even after returning from the psychiatric facility, my father's emotional state remained unstable. Irene recounted his refusal of rehabilitation, difficulties in eating, inability to convey his needs, and behavioral issues. Irene's unwavering support stood out, with her finding ways to communicate and care for him through the challenges. It was clear that Irene had played a crucial role in my father's recovery. The turning point came when my father, diligently attending rehab every day, stopped lashing out at the staff entirely. Initially, he wouldn't even try to get out of bed, but eventually, he voluntarily participated in exercises, and his condition improved significantly. Doctors were amazed at his remarkable recovery, and my father expressed pride in his progress. According to Irene, my father's transformation was a miracle, and it paved the way for him to leave the disability facility. Even though he faced difficulties, he was now able to lead a normal life. After hearing about his struggles, I didn't feel resentment. In fact, I was genuinely happy to know that he had always been thinking about me. Realizing that we both had moments of utter despair at the same time made me chuckle, and I thought, like father, like daughter. After sharing this realization with Irene and my father, they both laughed and shed tears. It was the warmest tears I had ever seen. Glancing out the window, I saw the sunset shining on the balcony. Mentioning that I was about to leave, my father intervened with a panicked voice, expressing how he didn't want to let me go again. We finally met. And I don't want to let you go, Katie. I know I may not have the right to ask this now, but I want us to be a family again. Please stay. As he spoke, tears different from earlier streamed down his face. Touched by his sincerity, I felt a mysterious warmth, as if the cold loneliness in my heart was slowly melting away. Despite my genuine happiness at my father's invitation, I couldn't shake the fear of potentially ruining the happiness he currently had with Irene. I stood there frozen, torn between wanting to decline the offer and the desire to continue living with my father. In that moment, Irene intervened with a sudden question. "Hey, Katie, do you think you'd reject me if I was your mom?" Startled by the unexpected question, I stared deep into Irene's eyes. She smiled tenderly, as if she could see straight into my conflicted heart. Her generous care and attention were so much like my real mother that it felt as if my real mother was pushing me forward. With the courage found in that moment, I replied, "If you'll have me, I'd love to be a part of this family." Shouting my answer, my father's face lit up with joy, almost toppling over from his wheelchair with excitement. Seeing him like that, I laughed heartily for the first time in a decade. Finally, I felt I had found a place where I belonged in the world. Half a year has passed since then. I'm now fervently preparing to pursue my dream of becoming a flight attendant, with plans to have the interview next year. Before coming back here, I lacked motivation and had given up thinking about my dreams and my future. However, after reuniting with my father, my mother's letter guided me once more. The last line of the letter read, "What are you up to now? Did you become the flight attendant you always dreamed of? No matter what the future holds, know that your mom is cheering you on." With my mother's loving words in my heart, I decided to chase after my dreams and look forward to spending peaceful days with my father and Irene.